Time.
Hi, Pelin. Good to see you.
All right, we can start. Caroline.
Okay, so welcome to the fifth edition, to the fourth session of this fifth edition of our online course and workshop for the Manifesto for the Just City, which is organized by our TU Delft Center for the Just City in collaboration with several universities. So I'm Caroline Newton. I'm an associate professor at the section of spatial planning in Delft, and I'm here with my colleagues, Roberto Rocco, Hugo Lopez, Aditi Natarayan, and I think maybe in the course of the evening, some more people will join the room. And again, we're super excited that you're here with us today, and it's even more nice to see that there's an ever-growing community of people committed to spatial justice and this concept of the just city. And so Roberto already said that the event is live streamed on YouTube, but it will also be made available in the form of a podcast. And several episodes are already available. And Roberto will again share the link in the chat. But so today, as we discuss this concept of the just city, we cannot ignore the conflicts that continue to affect people globally. The wars in Ukraine, in Congo, Sudan, occupied Palestine, and now Lebanon remind us how interconnected our world is and how crucial justice is in the pursuit of peace. And we strongly condemn the violence affecting civilians all around the world, especially in occupied Gaza and all the occupied Palestinian territories, and urge a solution that upholds human dignity and life. So for this manifesto of the Just City, we must say that it's super nice to see that over the course of a few years, the event has really grown and it has become a global initiative, bringing together more than 900 students from more than 100 universities from all over the world. And it has resulted in a number of published books with a total of over 266 manifestos. And all these books are downloaded for free from the website. And again, I think Roberto will share the link in the chat. So again, a reminder that the event is open to everyone, although it's aimed at students from disciplines related to the built environment. That is just an indication. It's really, we welcome everyone to join our manifesto. And before we will hear from our guest speaker, whom I will introduce in a moment, I first want to elaborate a bit again on what is a manifesto, because a manifesto is not just a document. It's a radical call to action, a powerful framework for building a hopeful approach to spatial planning. At least that is what we're trying to do here. And especially since we're facing growing inequalities, environmental crisis, and the constant push of neoliberal values into every corner of urban life, it's important to really make a strong voice and show how we can really reimagine our cities as places of inclusivity, equity, and justice. Manifestos also remind us to slow down and reflect. They push us to resist the rush for profit-driven, one-size-fits-all solutions that forget real human needs. By encouraging imagination and creativity, we're breaking away from old ideas, daring to envision urban spaces that truly serve people. And I think we will hear more about storytelling later, because storytelling in this context is really a powerful tool. It brings people together around a shared vision of spatial justice, for example, challenging systems that often silence diverse voices. That means that we also need to be committed to genuine participation. That means breaking down hierarchies and working alongside communities, trying to co-create future steps, and also challenging thus the structural inequalities that are built in our urban spaces. And finally, education plays a big role. By embracing transformative ways of learning that inspire critical thinking and activism, we think we're preparing a new generation, but also kind of pushing our own generations to really stop, reflect, and think critically. And we're trying to become planners, designers who are not only skilled, but also resilient and ethically grounded, ready to tackle the complexities of this different way of planning. And so our guest today, I think, will bring some important insights into this context, and especially into the importance of a critical pedagogy. So Catalina Ortiz, our guest speaker, is a professor of critical pedagogy and urban design at the Development Planning Unit of UCL. She has a whole career rooted in advancing justice and spatial justice, more particularly. Catalina's work transcends conventional boundaries by integrating storytelling, co-production, and critical reflection into urban practice. Her research particularly emphasizes Latin American cities, where she explores the role of narratives in reclaiming urban space and amplifying marginalized voices. Catalina is known for her contributions to insurgent planning, where she applies critical pedagogy to foster socially engaged, inclusive urbanism. And I'm very happy that I had the privilege of working with her while I was at the DPU. And so I could experience firsthand her dedication to shaping urban environments as spatial of care and agency. Her approach not only advocates for spatial equity, but also uses storytelling otherwise, as a powerful method to build empathy and solidarity in urban transformation. So I'm sure that this evening our expertise will bring invaluable insights to our ongoing discussions on the Just City, underscoring the crucial role of collaboration among scholars and practitioners and citizens devoted to reimagining inclusive urban futures. You can find publications by Catalina in the link shared in the chat. So without further delay, Catalina, I would like to give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Caroline and Roberto, for inviting me. This is a very exciting opportunity, and I'm one of your fans because you've been, really pushing forward to have this incredible opportunity of bringing together people from all over the world. So I'm gonna try to share my screen. Let's see. And today I was hesitant how to frame the presentation today. And I just decided to put together a bunch of things. So I may be rambling, but I wanted to precisely try to connect and give more examples of how am I framing what I would call a disobedient urban pedagogy, and how the role of storytelling is kind of infusing all the work that I've been doing for the last, I could say, decades. So I'm going to be sharing a bit part of my work, and deliberately I decided not to go very deep in any kind of theoretical big debates, because I think something that we've been learning a lot is that the more abstract it gets, the issue of the just city, the less graspable it is. And I feel that kind of the agency we have is in the very mundane, everyday kind of practice. And that's why I'm very kind of invested in shaping spaces for critical pedagogy as kind of the space where we have agency and kind of the interface, and how are we contributing directly to build that just city and shaping some imagination otherwise, if you will. So I think part of the opening, I could say that something that is very kind of close to my heart of how am I framing all my practice and what I do is partly this idea from Silvia Rivera-Kusikansky around understanding or framing knowing as a bodily political practice, because this gives us kind of a particular take in how we understand knowledge, and particularly urban knowledges in plural, and how we cannot detach, let's say, the head from the body, from the heart, and also that every practice and every kind of knowledge is part of our political practice. And for that, part of kind of the introduction that very generously Caroline put together, usually sometimes in these academic spheres, we forget that we are also where we come from, and we cannot detach ourselves from kind of the identity and the place we are kind of just an extension of. And in my case, I come from a region in the south of Colombia, part of the Orcunina Volcano, where practices and kind of in the borders of the Inca Empire, where I think all the tradition that kind of be synthesized in that flag that you see there, it really influences who am I in the world, where I come from, and how am I positioning myself, even though now I'm based in London and I do work in a big university. I think I'm always reminded that, I'm always connected to the place where I come from and the ways in which I see the city and my role in the world. But also part of kind of what influences me is understanding that the cities where I grew up, having shaped by the hands and the hearts and the bodies of many women that arrived flying, escaping from conflict and violence, and that with their hands have been the ones building literally big portions of the cities that we know. And particularly in the case of Colombia, we cannot understand our cities and urban realities and urban dynamics if we don't see also the city through the lens of that hole left by a bullet, right? This is a very kind of famous photography from Jesus Abad, Colorado, who has been one of the most important kind of journalists portraying the long conflict in Colombia. And I think that is not casual, and I think bringing or coming from a place where you can think of different categories of wounded cities or traumascapes or traumatized cities, that leaves an imprint in how you perceive the world. And I think this also shapes a lot my positionality and how the work I do is informed by these realities. And that's why I think I wanted to spend just a few minutes kind of giving a bit of the context of where I come from, because that determines also the type of practice I engage with. And I think some of you wrote in part of your heroes, Paulo Freire from Brazil. So I could write that as one of my heroes too. So we share something with someone that wrote that, because I think he really captured a lot of the intellectual genealogy of the Latin American school, if you will. And I think his work and his ideas have a lot of resonance now, more than ever, I could say. And he helped us to understand that critical pedagogy, seeks the cultivation of emancipated political subjects, and that we kind of connect and involve political praxis that is grounded in people's subjectivities, histories, and struggles. And I think it's with that in mind that I've been kind of conceiving and centering pedagogy, that usually in academic settings is seen as less than, usually is something that is part of the background, is not something that sometimes is featured as something that is intellectually challenging, or that is kind of at the forefront of how can we change the world. And I'm more aligned with what Bell Hooks says in terms of, all the kind of the revolutionary power that classroom settings offer. And I think that is where I'm coming from. And therefore, for me, it's very serious, the issue of pedagogy. And when I got this promotion to professor, I was like, no, I'm going to put it in my title, because this is a serious thing. And for me, it's a site of theory making at the same time, right? So I think that is something that I've been kind of investing a lot of time and energy. And because we are kind of thinking of how to even make sense this idea of the just city, I think for me it has been very important to try to connect how spatial justice and design justice is interconnected with all these dimensions of justice and cannot be understood without these different intersections that are a bit messy that are complicated in a way. But what I've been trying to systematize is trying to understand what are those connections, what are those intersections between epistemic justice and spatial justice, procedural justice, restorative justice. And I've been trying to tease in the work with several colleagues how we make sense of these multiple dimensions that are always working in tandem. And I think that has been part of kind of my arguments lately, that we cannot understand the spatial justice or the just city if we don't see these connections and these interactions, making, of course, our work more challenging, but analytically, it offers us also some clues in terms of how can we go about that. And part of what we've been doing with several colleagues, for instance, at faculty level, is trying to push the idea of, what do we do? How do we bring, what is race doing in the nice field of the built environment? Because what we kind of, in a moment that we are reckoning with racial justice, and we see kind of this blunt racism displayed in many shapes and forms, the built environment professions have been very kind of politically neutral, problematically politically neutral. And we decided to put together kind of a simple curriculum that could speak to practitioners and people that work around the built environment, but that they don't feel, or that they didn't have kind of the tools to engage with these questions about race and what is, or our role and responsibility in reproducing racialized justice at the same time. So we put together this resource that is also available online, trying to understand, like kind of key, or teasing out key questions around what racial encounters have you had, where are you located, does race, quote unquote, affect where you feel you belong? Can you see race in the cultural symbols around you, right? So all the role of the material culture, what is the future that you can imagine, and what are you gonna do, right? Also that call to action that is aligned somehow with the manifesto. And I think, that has been some of the, let's say, baby steps to think about it. But also, when we are in the university, we are part of a broader set of struggles. And I see as part and parcel of our work, being in the front line, in the picket line, trying to fight for labor, for our labor rights. And that is part also how you model and you practice what you preach, right? Justice is not something that happens in the vacuum, but also, is anchored in the very spaces where we work. And I think the picket line became a very important pedagogical space, at least to engage with our students and understanding and shaping and becoming a setting to discuss how this occurs in different places and how these struggles manifest across different political regimes and geographies. But also public space as a space of where we can expand our pedagogical processes, and particularly in the work around urban design. I think part of what we've been doing with the bigger team has been trying to think, right, if urban design has been complicit in the reproduction of the spatial configurations of privilege, then by recalibrating the urban design practice, perhaps we can have some agency in reshaping more just cities. And bringing then in that process different strategies, different methodologies, like for instance, in this case, testing, body mapping as a strategy to understand and connect the spatial realities of the students to the broader, conceptual questions around spatial justice, but also how we engage with emotions and storytelling as part of our daily interaction with the city and how we experience the city itself, or trying to bring different ideas in terms of role-playing or games to really understand what are the different power knowledge games that shape the city, what are the drivers of change, in order to identify what is the leverage that we have in terms of introducing kind of either disruption or spaces for transformation in the strategies of spatial interventions. And so in that case, we work around this idea of comparative urban design, trying to interlink different realities and kind of work simultaneously in situated strategies for spatial justice. And in this case, we were testing and exploring ideas of border-making practices both in Medellin and Beirut. I think something that is essential is understanding what are kind of those patterns of resonance and connections, not forgetting the singularity of places, but seeing the connection across places. And now that we have here in the audience people from all over, you could see that there are patterns and elements that are connected and that we can learn from in this kind of translocal experimentation. And also trying to think in terms, what are the agendas of research-based design, but also how can we shape and connect with communities' priorities and learning from the people that work with grassroots organizations as kind of the key leaders in urban design, rather than the ones that are in university considering themselves kind of the experts. And for that, we kind of have different iterations for several years of translocal networks of solidarity. And I think the role of solidarity here is absolutely key, because in a way we frame ourselves as fellow travelers rather than helpers or experts of giving social assistance, which is a lot of the framework or the framing that many development agencies kind of put out there. And something that has been, coming up in the work that I've been doing has helped me to pin down what are kind of the critique in terms of the mainstream use of storytelling, that a lot of people that are doing branding, city branding, marketing, is very good at doing. And I think part of kind of the use of storytelling in urban planning is in a way exacerbating what we would call the social matrix of power, of colonial power. And there are 4 kind of key elements that I identified to be problematic in this instance. Because that kind of use of, let's say, the mainstream use of storytelling centers on individual accounts of professional planners, depending kind of their epistemic privilege, and in a way understanding that there's kind of one source of urban knowledge, and that is kind of emanating from the experts with capital E. The other is that supports underpinning extractive logics of urban development, and therefore the use of the different narratives in rebranding places, and with extractive logics is something that is kind of very common. That perpetuates also a dualist approach between emotion and reason, and people and place, and remains silent about the structural, the epistemic violence and the desacralization of the world and more in general. And I think that is where somehow I got more interested in the use of storytelling, because I think that stories are kind of pivotal means for the circulation of urban knowledges, but also an opportunity to bridge what Boaventura dos Santos calls the ecologies of knowledges to foster cognitive justice. And I think cognitive justice is an essential piece to address spatial justice. So it's not only about the built environment, but also all the symbolic worlds and the meanings that we build around that. And it's true storytelling that kind of we reshape that. And in that way, I resonate a lot with what Leonie Sandercock tells us, that says the way we narrate the city becomes constitutive of urban reality, affecting the choices we make, the ways we then might act, right? So I think it's completely intertwined with our possibilities for action. And I think it's interesting to see or understand kind of the use of storytelling to foster empathy or to understand meanings of, of complex experiences, but also inspire action. And therefore, this whole idea of bridging with cognitive justice is also trying to connect or dig into a dimension of the just city that help us to understand the different, the coexistence of the different knowledges about the city, that help us to identify what are those practices that sustain livelihoods and life chances of people. So I think this focus on kind of what Ruth Wilson Wilmer would call life-affirming infrastructures is something that in a way is connected to these approaches. So part of what we kind of been doing and trying to think of storytelling otherwise as an epistemological disobedience. Recalls and connects to this idea that what if we conceive our understanding of cities through the lenses of the people that have been making the city themselves, and in particular, the role of women in the production and the social reproduction of self-built neighborhoods. In particular, I've been working around the role of women in the neighborhood of Moravia, in the city of Medellin in Colombia, and working closely with the story of Mama Chila, who's like a central character in understanding kind of that, all the universe of the production of the neighborhood that oftentimes escapes the big narratives of urban change, or the role of the heroes of the story when you have the charismatic mayors that are the ones that are entitled as the kind of the leaders and the ones that have transformed the city. So in a way, Mama Chila is the anti-hero of the story, and yet the most important one in the story that I'm trying to make. So part of understanding and learning from those practices of, you know, the collective action of having the community kitchens and trying to the makeshift production of collective infrastructure that in the context of Medellin is called Coinvite, comes one of the projects that we did prior to the pandemic that we call storytelling for urban learning. And learning from those practices is where we try to connect ideas and methodologies for creating togetherness, for using the whole idea of the kitchen as a learning setting, and trying to connect the role of recipes, or trying to think urban strategies also as a type of recipe, cooking as an experimental activity, but also how to foster collective action. And it's in that process that we attempt to create a network of urban storytellers and generated an alliance, a learning alliance with all the organizations that you see there in the logos. I'm not going to go into details, but just to see that there's like a very asymmetric location in power of all the people that are in that picture. But I think one common denominator was that we were all urban storytellers, from the head of UN Habitat for Latin America to the community leader of a very recently created neighborhood, right? And all in between, from the community radio to the big professors and the people from the local government. So with that, we explore different strategies to kind of thinking of how we are cooking urban narratives. What are the recipes that have been told, and in this case, kind of the urban model or the best practice of social urbanism, and how we could kind of, in a way, bring a critical instance or bring about the ideas of the people that were left out of that recipe. So part of the kind of question in this activity was like, what is missing in the recipe that we've been told that is the one that is feeding us all, and that is kind of one side perspective or simplified version of urban transformation. And we created at the end a toolkit trying to summarize what were the strategies to create and foster togetherness, and how by using storytelling, kind of we create a set of methodologies to bring together not only strategies for bonding, like kind of creating those affective infrastructures that are essential for any co-production of knowledge, but also how can use different techniques to create different stories of the self, identifying kind of the different, the singularity of the different actors, but also how can we pave the way to create a story of us, and what are kind of those, the mobilization of collective stories, and trying to think then, and with the use of manifestos, if you see in section D, part of how can we create also collective action. And we use the exquisite corpse, kind of the surrealist technique, to create part of these manifestos as part of the end of this process. But also we kind of keep evolving and thinking in what is the role of, for instance, living heritage, but particularly what if we think self-built neighborhoods as the living heritage of the city. So rather than a problem, what if we understand the neighborhoods as this living heritage? And how can we focus if we use the lenses of living heritage, issues of around care, around memory, around recycling, and around community connections? And for that, we created a set of strategies to map let's say the assets and the spaces that are valued by people. And that's why we created the Atlas of Living Heritage of the neighborhood, and trying to think and create some artifacts also for interaction with the different community members as part of our partners. So in other words, we were trying to get at the polyphony of the different plots that create life in this particular neighborhood, and trying to see how different people and different groups that were working in close collaboration with us across different grassroots organizations were shaping the living heritage of the place. The other aspect I think is relevant, both analytically, but also practically, is this idea of thinking storytelling otherwise as a set of sentipensante threads. Sentipensar is a concept that, if we go to the genealogy of some of the main contributions of Latin American thinkers, Falsborda and participatory action research, is a must reference, and you need to go to the 70s. So I've been going a lot into the 70s to learn and to read something that sometimes we forget, that 50 years later, we having been going to the source. And I think that emancipatory power of these ideas around participatory action research, and particularly how Sentipensar has been the basis of the work that Falsborda initiated in Colombia, are very important to to go back and learn from. And I think this idea of the role, and that we cannot really disconnect our understanding of the city from the collective affection towards place, is essential. And in part is illustrated by the role of Mama Chila in Medellin, when she, with her hands and the neighbors, created a space to take care of the children that most of them only had their mother and didn't have any place to go. So I think also remind us all the efforts to create infrastructures for care in moments of acute conflict, but also when the state is oftentimes absent, right? And part of that work of tracing the living heritage of the place help us to think of, but how we trace, if the neighborhood, and if in this atlas, we trace the the living heritage, those practices of care or around the livelihoods through recycling, or the community connections around the different groups and organizations and the mobilization strategies that have been used, we ended up generating an iteration of the project that was called Archivo Vivo, or Living Archive, trying to think of if then the neighborhood is also the archive of all the efforts and all the waves and all the palimpsest of the different contributions of the different groups that have been there, then how can we actually make more visible and trace and provide all the evidences to understand the role of women in the territorial reclamation of the neighborhood. And that became very strong, and part of what we did, now this is, I think, 2 years ago, has been trying to understand also the different modalities and the stories of care, and the intergenerational responsibility and the intergenerational learning, in how care is embodied and practiced and have been enacted in the neighborhood, and how has been shifting. But also, what is the role of emotions in the interaction with the space, and how, let's say, a responsible urban design practice needs to take into account that very emotional interplay with the neighborhood. So we co-design different methodologies with community leaders to understand how, is this connection, and we use this color coding. We spend a lot of hours trying to think first, what are the emotions that can be related to places, but also culturally, what are the colors that can be allocated to these emotions? So it was like a very interesting strategy to design the methodology together, to test it, and to put it in place using a mosaic, a map of the neighborhood that we were kind of working with, and testing with different community members that were part kind of the network of our partner organizations, in order to trace kind of what are the life stories, and how that in a way leaves also an imprint in the use of the place, but also how that has affected all the trajectories of housing tenure, or the interplays with the state around that. And I think the other aspect, and I don't know how am I doing with time, refers to border thinking and communal healing. And I think that is part of what I've been very obsessed lately. I think now that at least in Colombia, there's, let's say, kind of a new political opening. And after 2016, when the peace process with the FARC was signed, speaking about peace was something more tangible and possible. And let's say that in the last 2 years, something that feels more in the air. And I think that has prompted like a different set of, it has opened other doors that perhaps before were not even in the table. And
Catalina,
that's why
you've spoken for 28 minutes, so you're doing very well.
Okay, great. I'm very proud, because usually it takes forever. Okay, so no, we're good. So I think around, this idea of communal healing, and how we kind of even see or frame ourselves as urban practitioners, but also how can we learn to be healers of places, right? And I think we need to, on the one hand, take some distance from the Western approaches to, what an urban practitioner is, and maybe embrace unknown and uncharted territory that, in a way, we want to take seriously this intersection with restorative planning, restorative justice. We really need to change our skill set. So, for instance, just dealing with the map of emotions, that, is like a Pandora box. Are you able to engage with that? What are the protocols, the ethics, who needs to be there, how people enter, how do you engage them, how do they leave, how you connect? I think it opens up a lot of questions that we were, really being very mindful and careful of how to deal with it, and how, that was very gentle and very slow, if you will, testing and then recalibrating, and always in conversation with our partners. And this idea of kind of territorial healing is something that I've been kind of working around in terms of thinking, what is, the sequence, or what are the dimensions of this intersection between spatial and restorative justice, right? And I think this idea of territorial healing, in a way, help us to think about that, right? In terms of evoke narratives of territorial memory and truth-telling, reclaiming in terms of affective cartographies of body, territory, and earth, mending in terms of the therapeutic circles and collective weaving as part of kind of the strategies of more symbolic reparation around weaving that a lot of groups have been kind of engaged with, not only in Colombia, but in many places. Restore in terms of rest, spatial imagination, and joy. What is kind of the role in that? Reconcile in terms of the more reparative infrastructures and land restitution, right? Like, what is the hardcore? Like, I think here you would connect a bit with distributive justice, right? The question of land comes very prominently. And in the case of Colombia, kind of the point one of the peace process is about land restitution. And if land restitution is the number one element, how that translates also in the urban settings connects very much with the intervention where most of the victims are, or the forced displaced communities that are precisely in the self-built neighborhoods. And re-exist, that is more in terms of thinking transformative reparations, not a repair that brings you back to where you were, but a reparation that puts you, let's say, in a different stage. And there, it's speaking a lot to what Mama Chila would tell us, right? That she was flying away from poverty and violence in order to take care, of their kind of dignity and safety, but also facing what she says, we had to escape to take care of our life and our families. We had to face the inequalities and the indifference of a city that didn't belong to us. And I was one of the first moms of Moravia, and I had to deal with a lot of people's pain, right? So when you have this kind of intergenerational trauma, and that is a bit of the starting point, it places us in a very kind of tricky and complicated situation, but we at least need to start acknowledging that. And for that, in part of the work that we've been doing is trying to trace these stories of memories and migration, right? If at least 1/5 of the population in Colombia has been forcibly displaced or has been victim of conflict of any of the modalities, then it tells us a lot about the story of the country, but also the political situation and what are the different impacts in terms of economic displacement or forced displacement or political displacement, and how these are kind of intertwined. But also what are those stories are not, again, in abstraction, but are very concrete and embedded in place, and are very associated with the people that we were working with, and trying to trace kind of those stories and those trajectories, and that in order to help us understand that when we are engaging with a place, it's not that place, but are multiple places at the same time. And I think that kind of interlocal aspect is something very crucial in order to trace those trajectories, memories, but also trying to find what are the elements that are productive from a design perspective. And I think foodscapes was a strategy, mapping foodscapes, trying to think of what are the things that bring people together, and also how that help them to identify kind of also lines of identity with the places they were coming from, right? So I think that allow us to think in different strategies, and not forgetting this idea of healing, in how we kind of are learning a lot from different praxis and debates around communal feminism, that tell us that we cannot detach the body from the territory, from the earth or the planet, and that we are a continuous. And therefore, if we see, let's say, urban space through those lenses, then that put us in a very different place than the Western assumptions about, the detachment of bodies and space, for instance. And I think in one of the images, you see one of our guests that we invited, an indigenous woman from the Maya community in Mexico, that she's an expert on healing. And I think for us was very important to bring someone that has, other type of knowledge, another type of sensibility, another cosmogony, to help us grasp with something that we were not equipped to deal with. And I think it was very important to bring kind of her force and her wisdom in order to address and connect the work that we were doing with the women of the community that we were working with. And sometimes that wouldn't be in the toolkit of an traditional urban practitioner, but for us, kind of the role of care and healing open other doors that we were not, let's say, used to engage with, precisely because we were linking these spatial emotions, body mapping, and kind of the ritualistic space became some area where we expanded and understood that we needed to embrace kind of other knowledges and other type of practitioners, precisely to address those elements that, let's say, escape the rational perspective of understanding cities. And I think, as I was mentioning before, this idea of, like body territory open up a lot of things that were very complex in terms of, understanding that, for instance, to be a woman in Moravia hurts, and how do you engage with people if that is kind of the first, that is kind of the really embodied connection with the place, if it's a place that is related, to pain, but at the same time, in this second one, it says, estoy orgullosa de ser moravita. So both you have pain, trauma, but at the same time, you're proud and you feel that you belong in that place, and that is the place where you belong and you identify with it, right? So you have to deal with those kind of contradictions and tensions, and that is kind of part and parcel of what we were engaging with. And trying then to think and connect these intergenerational connections. And you see on one of those images, like all the generations of the women that have been part of the place, of the building, of the neighborhood. And as part of this...
you are at 37 minutes, so just for you to know.
Perfect, good, we're almost there. And part of kind of the let's say one aspect of this project was precisely kind of doing a counter monument to the role of women in sustaining literally the life of the neighborhood. And in conjunction with one of the artists that has been working with the people in the neighborhood for many years, it was a visual summary of the project and kind of the different strands that we work with in terms of security of tenure, in terms of ecological reparations, and in terms of the homing strategies for migrants and migration trajectories, right? So this mural now is kind of at the entrance of one of the main streets in front of the cultural center of the people that we were working with. So it becomes like a stop every time that we are gonna enter the neighborhood. And this is kind of the latest kind of iteration, right? Because we were playing with this idea of the living archive, and we developed like a digital platform where we collected over 600 entry points of different kinds of knowledge about the neighborhood. We kind of recover one collection of historic pictures that portray the women of the neighborhood in the 70s. So it was more a discourse, but at the end we found kind of the evidence, historic photography of the role of the women in the neighborhood. And so in one of the exhibitions, so we did this kind of digital platform, we did an exhibition in Medellin, but then we had an invitation here in London to kind of do a summary of the project. And then I thought, just having a screen would be very boring. So I decided to do collaging on what, using kind of the diagram of the mural, but also bringing some of the different pieces of the material that we've been collecting for so many years, and trying to do kind of a more interactive kind of piece with this idea of the constant weaving and the constant overlay of pieces. And so here you could see a bit how we illustrated here in London, a bit of a summary of how we brought into display kind of a bit of the flavor of the work that we've been doing, and of course kind of the digital part, but at least a more tactile material of the collage made by different fabrics. And that kind of had led us, and I think that is kind of one of the latest iteration of the work that we've been doing, and I think, Caroline, you saw that in London a bit, is the work around pedagogies of territorial reparation. And I think this is something that we are still exploring at the moment, trying to think then, how can we frame the idea of neighborhood upgrading as a strategy of reparation, particularly for victims of conflict. So we've been doing this work both in Medellin, but also in Cali. And in Cali, we have done kind of a lot of work. I didn't bring that here, but it's kind of helping us to go back and think on this idea of territorial healing, and how kind of the technologies and the pedagogies that the the collectives, particularly of women that have been victim of the conflict, are already using it. So this idea of the rituals and the mandalas is not something that we are generating, but rather we are learning, and we are being guided by the community, different community groups, particularly Convivamos, that work in one of the fringes of the city, in order to make sure that you have kind of that sacralized space. And I think bringing ritual has been one of the main lessons of anyone that is working around reparative justice. And I think that is part of kind of the very practical elements that is shaping also the methodologies of engagement with all the different, let's say, stakeholders that we engage with. And it's through the idea of the spiral and kind of the light and the fire and all the elements that all the work starts and closes. So I think that ritual element is becoming very, very important in how we're thinking even a pedagogy for territorial reparation. And with that, I'm going to start closing. I could say these are a bit the arrivals, right? So after kind of going through a bit of I don't know how many years of different iterations and kind of learning of different projects, I think it's very evident that, we need to understand the urban as kind of this plural sphere of collective socio-material struggles in different fronts. And based on that, part of kind of my own pedagogy and creative practice has been in doing all these collages that you see. That is kind of my side job now, in order to make sure you have say an artistic expression of it. But also the construction of manifestos themselves as a pedagogy, and I'm going to share in the chat shortly, is something that I do with my students to summarize what we do in the classroom after several weeks of being together. And something that is critical as well is trying to decenter the role of English in all this, because I think there's, anti-colonial struggles are not the main language is not English. And I think, I'm a bit obsessed in kind of having these multilingual approaches, because the richness of all languages bring different light to things that perhaps get completely lost if we only kind of exchange in English. So we have a bit of a discussion on it. And part of what we do, or we've been doing with this kind of urban design manifesto, and here is in feminine, after discussing with some colleagues, is precisely bringing the different dimensions of a spatial justice intersected with the other dimensions of justice in terms of redistribution or recognition, or epistemic justice or reparative justice, and trying to see then how we intersect and connect with the idea of design and spatial justice. So this is kind of an attempt to summarize and to connect, that kind of diagram that I show you at the beginning. And just to kind of wrap up, I think I'm on time. I also have my own manifesto, so we can transition to your exercise and to kind of the name of the whole event. And I think for me, kind of my manifesto for Disobedient Urban Pedagogy kind of has 10 points. One is to unlearn the Eurocentric canons on the production of a space and its embedded white supremacy. Second, kind of this disobedient urban pedagogy aims at achieving a spatial justice, but in tandem, particularly with epistemic and reparative justice. It envisions a disobedient urban pedagogy that is politically relevant and committed to establishing equitable spatial planning systems. So I'm not giving up on planning, but a different type of planning. Promotes pluriversal spatial imaginations, and think someone mentioned one of the heroes, Arturo Escobar, for sure, that is coming from there a lot. And that is our good Escobar. So I'm the only Escobar I'm proud of. Fifth, emphasizes a sense in thinking, or a sentipensar, an ethics of sentipensar. that centers care, empathy in the learning processes. 6, that connects multi-scalar and translocal perspectives of body territory. And I think we need to be always kind of moving across not only scales, more in kind of in the traditional sense, but also how can we make these connections of this continuum of body, territory, earth that communal feminism is kind of teaching us, and promote inter-trans cross-disciplinary approaches for sure, and supports counter-hegemonic territorial practices. And I think now perhaps connecting with Carolina, with what Carolina started, right? Like we need to be more explicit in the things that we are anti. So it's anti-fascist, it's anti-militarist, it's anti-capitalist, it's anti-heteronormative, and it's anti-patriarchal. And it, it stands for political coalitions. Because now we cannot be neutral, never can be neutral. And, that I'm very passionate about. And 9 explores diverse and creative methodologies to unveil relational ontologies. And I think, that whole idea of that interconnection and interdependence and the radical interdependence that Arturo Escobar kind of reflects around is very important. And then assumes the strategies of co-production of territorial knowledge with affection, with joy, and with beauty. And if it's not like that, I'm not happy to work in anything else. So thank you so much. And I'll leave you here with some other sources that can help you expand some of those ideas. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Catalina.
Thank you. Thank you, Catalina. Yes, thank you so much. It's a beautiful presentation with a lot of things that I think are close to a lot of people in the room here, to our hearts. And I also very much appreciate how you kind of make the circle or connect the circle back, starting really from, indeed, it's important where we are from. It has an impact. But also one thing that I'm really curious about is you mentioned a lot of things that are so important, and I think it's so important that these things are finally being valued, but it's also very challenging. It's when you talk about emotions, this kind of soft things that very often like linked to more female approaches, let's say, but I can imagine that it's not been an easy road to do that and to put that so central, because it's so different from this kind of probably very Western, top-down, rational male approach, but it's so important and it's so powerful to see. So I'm just curious if you could share a bit of that kind of struggle that you have for sure encountered.
Shall I go and answer that, or would you like to cluster some questions? Because I see that in the chat there's some, right?
Yeah, yes,
As
and I'm sure there will be more.
Maybe Domenica, if you want to say your question.
Yeah, sure. Actually, I was having a second question after you read the manifesto, but maybe I can start with the one I put in the chat. And also, thanks for the presentation. I think I found another hero in the urban studies that comes from Latin America. It's a really special moment for me being in this class. The question I have is, how would you apply this methodology, especially the one you were talking about, going beat, in urban spaces where the narrative of neoliberal governance eliminates or turn individual women's action into something invisible or something that is imperceptible for the rest of the people, or maybe where urban spaces are super hostile to collective initiatives that are trying to challenge actually the power structures.
Caroline, Roberto, would you like me to answer
Yes.
those, or shall we get the other one? Because I see there's another one. Agatha, I think.
There is one from Naya Larenas. Do you have the cuerpo y territorio image in the complete resolution? Oh, that's a technical question. wait, Luz. Luz, do you want to say your question?
Yes, of course. Hi. Well, first of all, many thanks for your presentation. Very inspiring, also for the students, but also for us that sometimes we also work with communities when we are teaching with students. So also I have this question more connected with your work with the community. So because I see that you have a lot of studies and workshop with the community with topics that are not easy to deal with some topics about, you say also preparing and topics about or dealing with the troubles or conflicts. So how do you deal with them? How do you, with this topic, how do you approach to the community? How do you do this process in the long term? I mean, I guess that you first talk to them, then you work with them, then you have maybe a process of giving them back information and also giving them back or discussing the final results. So for me, this is about the main question. How do you do this in the backstage, let's say, of this nice and beautiful workshop?
Yeah, maybe, is it okay if we start with the
Yes.
ones we have? Okay, because maybe I think I can start with the last one and then going backwards. So I address some kind of different layers. Thank you, Luz, for the question. I think something that I didn't fully explain is that part of kind of the ethical approach to doing this is through the lenses of learning alliances. And in a learning alliance, you know, we all kind of arrive with a genuine sense of curiosity. And therefore, that requires a lot of conversations back and forth. And also that there was some other question about, you know, where are you talking about? Where are you from? And all these things. I've been working in Medellin for around 20 years. So I'm not necessarily a newcomer or a parachuter in the place. And that, in a way, it gives me a bit of the advantage of being insider and outsider at the same time. And most of the projects that I show you today are connected somehow or centers one particular neighborhood. So it's been kind of going over and over and digging deeper and expanding or connecting or in conversation with, because otherwise, you rightly say, it wouldn't be feasible to go and deal with topics or aspects. You know, testing this body territory mapping wouldn't be possible for me to do as day one with an organization that I don't know, right? You could do that, and I'm sure many people do, but it wouldn't be kind of, the experience would be very different. So I think, as in anything, you need to build trust, and the only way to build trust is that you show up consistently throughout the years with different shapes and forms in a way, or with different organizational t-shirts. And therefore, we have developed like a friendship with many of the people in the neighborhood, and we are in constant connection. You know, we have WhatsApp groups, and every time there's like an opportunity for getting funding, I'm trying, you know, we're going to get it, but we work despite the funding, and we're thinking always, okay, what could be next? What could be next? Or even if we are not engaging with the students, trying to read the political opportunity of the moment. And if, you know, like for instance, now there's an opportunity for the upgrade of the spatial plan of the city. So now we are already, you know, channeling some funding for people to get together and have a response and make use of what we have done to have a concrete proposal for the transformation of the plan, right? So we have, like, let's say, a political angle that runs in parallel, and this work kind of fits into that. And therefore, is not bounded to an academic output. Because, you know, today I was like, oh, well, I should be writing more articles about that, but we've been too busy doing things that we haven't had much time of writing the beautiful, glossy academic articles, at least of the last iterations. And I think, you know, that, of course, I think going a bit back to what Caroline was asking, you know, not everyone values that, because if I go for a review, then you would be assessed in terms of how many publications have come out of this. But then perhaps what is more important is that document of 3 pages that is the summary that is going to be given to the local authorities, right, in terms of the political impact. Or the organization that has been formed, that is the Mesa de Incidencia Política, you know, like a consistent group that is meeting every week to discuss and to put together this kind of political strategy. So for me, that would be a success, but that wouldn't make it for an article or a book or a chapter, right? So I think, there's a bit of a disconnection of universities wanting to show impact, but then on the reality in terms of you are not measured through it. You are measured through the traditional means. And of course, kind of going to kind of the intangible and the invisible requires that, you know, that work around the effective infrastructures, because you cannot get into that and kind of have the flexibility to explore something that we don't know how to handle it if you haven't built that trust and that connection, and if you don't know kind of the territory and the political, you know, architecture of the place. For us to have the time and the energy to be testing the colors and asking what are the emotions and what do we do with this place, that a lot of people in the map shows as the place where many people have been killed. How we just get away from it, you know, what is the room for the unspeakable and the untold. And I think that is something that we kind of been learning of, that as we know, not all is knowledgeable, you know, you cannot know everything, but also there's a lot of space for the unspeakable. And those more intangible ways of, you know, like using color codes or drawing into the body things, kind of allow us to circumvent the discursive element that sometimes we get so trapped about. And that is something that we're learning. I mean, I couldn't say we have found a way, but I think it's something that we are kind of engaging with constantly and reflecting. I think we're doing a reflective piece with one of the community leaders. And we are using a lot kind of the metaphor of the weaving, where we're weaving our thoughts, and we selected like 10 threads. And so we are using one thread is about the unspeakable. And that thread of the unspeakable is something that we are reflecting, particularly to connect with those actors. And going back to the point about hostile environments, I think that Domenica mentioned, you know, when we are in places where you see or you feel that there's non-state armed actors that play a very important role in the territorial control of the place. You know, there are these unspeakable forces that sometimes people use euphemisms, you know, so how to craft a space where you can talk about certain things and certain places, and sometimes completely avoid certain places or certain topics. So for instance, in the case of Moravia, we know that an area called El Morro, that during the pandemic completely got occupied by people coming from Venezuela, different places, but also maybe new iterations of armed actors. A lot of the community leaders that we work with said that they didn't feel safe going there. So they already established a strategy for avoiding certain places or speaking in certain ways about issues around housing or around public space or around risk, right? So those are constant negotiations. And I think having a bit the trust of people and not making you the one to put kind of what is the agenda, but rather listening to what is feasible according to the political situation in every place. Because you cannot wait until there's like complete, the right conditions to act, because there's never going to be the ideal conditions to get together.
I'm a bit mindful of time, because we have to have a few minutes at the end to talk about the manifesto. How do we go about there is one more question from Nindi Tarari. Yes?
Yes. Can you hear my voice?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Actually, my questions kind of already answered by the previous one, but my next question maybe, what role should the government play in facilitating and supporting this bottom-up approach? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think something that I learned is that you work with the state in some cases. So in the Convite project, we had delegates from the local state, particularly the ones that were working on the legalization of plots and land, and the ones that were kind of the officially designated people to work in neighborhood upgrading. So the ones that had kind of a voice in there. And so there we work with the state. In the project of living heritage, for instance, that was more building a clear argument against the strategy of renewal that the state had in place. It was more working against the state, right? Building a whole empirical evidence to contest the decision of planning. And I could say that in the project of the living archive, we worked despite the state, because we were kind of creating a different imagination around, what does it mean to have the neighborhood as a living archive, and what are all these textile registers, and what has been done, and what are the knowledges of the place. That is a work that is kind of, let's say, despite the state, and we didn't feel that kind of the local state had a crucial role to play there. But for instance, in the work around territorial reparations, we work with the state because we are advocating to them to frame neighborhood upgrading as a strategy of reparation, and kind of doing pedagogy in terms of showing, like how the location of victims of conflict is the same of the neighborhoods that needs neighborhood upgrading. Like it's a pedagogical process because they need to be brought on board, right? So I would say always with, despite, and against in all its combinations.
There is another question from Iram. Can we do this question still, Roberto? Is that fine?
Yes, let's do one more question really quick, and then we have still 10 minutes for the manifesto.
Good.
Irem?
Okay, so yeah, I'm here. And Catalina, thank you for your presentation. My question is about the behavioral changes, actually, because of the maps that you showed about the emotions of the first people. My question is, following these mappings and participatory projects, have you observed any significant behavioral changes in those neighborhoods after you've done this participatory projects?
Well, I'm not sure if I understand your question correctly, because my intention was not creating behavioral change per se, but changing, first devising together strategies for togetherness and, giving spaces for collective imagination. And, so if you are going to, measure anything, for me, the measure is that there's autonomous groups that have been, there's a new project called Living Archive in a different neighborhood. Part of what we've been doing in terms of territorial reparation has been traveling towards national policy and is in the national plan, or is kind of being a version of it implemented in the municipality in Cali, or, you know, there are reverberations or lines of, you know, a bit of impact, but I wouldn't think that we were set to change behavior of people, because I think the behavioral change was not, it's not the problem. I think what we've been trying to do with different degrees of success, if you will, is changing the narrative about those places, and, you know, kind of just contributing to shape spaces of collective action. So the fact that they have already a board that meet, you know, without any of our input, but perhaps some of our resources, is that people are organized and are doing their work, and they are organizing and shaping their strategy of political incidence with the local government. That is not a change of behavior, but it's an impact and kind of learning and cultivating kind of the collective work that is not coming from us, but it's like, because we've been working together for so many years. So I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, I understand. I totally understand. Thank you.
Well, I think we have really come to the end of Catalina's participation. On behalf of TÜV Delft and all my colleagues from the Center of the Just City, thank you so much, Catalina, for this really super inspiring lecture. I have to say that you are the second person who brings the Senti Pensar to our discussion, and I think this concept deserves a lot of attention. So thanks a lot for it. Caroline, do you want to say a few final words, or?
Well, yeah, just a really, really warm thank you, Catalina. And just as a reaction also to the last question, I think what you are changing, and what I hope that when I share your work with my students, is our kind of practices and our ways of doing. And I think for that, you're really super inspirational. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you. Now we are going to give you a few, thanks, Catalina. We are going to give you a few, first I'm going to stop the recording, and I'm going to stop the